this video, I'm driving this Audi AT Sport to find out what happens when you combine the power unit from a Mk2 Golf GTI with the smart, compact, executive set of clothes. Back in the late 1970s, the life of an Audi product manager or brochure designer was pretty straightforward. There was the 80, and there was the 100, and that was it. There had briefly been a 50 until 1978, at least in mainland Europe, which was the same thing as a Mark I Volkswagen Polo. A 200 turned up in 1979, which was basically a 100 that had won the lottery, but that was basically your lot. You had two sizes of footprint, a choice of 4 cylinders or 5, varying amounts of tinsel, and that was your Audi range brochure done. Then, in 1980, this happened, and changed Audi's image overnight. The Audi Quattro brought rallying success by the bucket load and a whole lot of sporting cachet. The Audi Quattro and its non-turbocharged Audi Coupe cousin were based on the B280, and so it seemed only sensible for the parent car to bathe in a little bit of reflected sporting glow. So for the 1983 model year, Audi introduced the GTE model in mainland Europe, which Audi UK imported and rebadged as the AT Sport. It had the chrome blacked out, smart multi-spoke alloys, a spoiler on the back and sports seats inside. To back up its go-faster looks, the Sport sported the 1800cc fuel-injected engine from the much-loved Golf GTI. At around the same time came the groundbreaking C3 generation of the Audi 100, with its radical flush-fitting windows, smooth aero looks, and a sticker in the window proclaiming its coefficient of drag of just 0.30. This suddenly made every other executive car look about as relevant as a cravat on a motorbike, not least its smaller brother. To hold the fort before the arrival of the super smooth aero B3 version of the 80 for the 1987 model year, Audi introduced this facelift in late 1984 for the B2's final 2 years. It's neatly done. The slightly more rounded nose and tail meant it could sit alongside the new 100 in the showroom without looking like it had wandered in lost, and only the misalignment between the side crease and the orange-red split of the taillight could possibly jar slightly, if you're being really picky. In March 1986, when this particular car was brand new, an Audi AT Sport would have cost you £9,714, which was £445, or about 4.5% more than a 5-door Mark II Golf GTI. It was also £319 more than a 4-door BMW 318i, its obvious rival. Although for that money, the E30 came with wind-up windows and steel wheels and was basically in miserable punishment spec that you only got if you had the Marquis de Sade as your fleet manager. As for Mercedes, the carburetted base model 190 was a hefty £1,200 more, so it was pretty clear which of the premium German browns was out-premiuming the others. And yes, out-premiuming is a word. It's how language evolves, alright? Power in the AT Sport is 112 bhp, the same as the Golf GTI. That's only fractionally more than the 110 bhp that came from the old 1600 engine in the Mark I Golf GTI and the older GLE version of the Audi 80. But there's a lot more torque, 118 pound-foot, which is really what matters when you want to press on in the real world. Like the Golf, it uses Bosch K-Jetronic multi-point continuous mechanical fuel injection. You won't believe how many takes it took to say that. This late car might actually be KE-Jet, like my later Audi AT B3, which is the same but with an extra actuator for electronic control of the fuel pressure. What's different from the Golf is that the engine is mounted north-south instead of east-west, but it still drives the front wheels. There's lots of space under the bonnet here to get at things. You could even fit in a whole extra cylinder, but then you'd have an Audi 90, and that's a whole other story. The Audi is a bigger and heavier car than the Golf, but not by as much as you'd think, only about 5%. But still, to keep up the sportiness, the final drive ratio in the AT is lower, and the first 4 of the 5 gears have lower ratios too. Car Magazine hit the 60 miles an hour benchmark from a standing start in 9.2 seconds versus 8.3 in the Volkswagen. What I'm not certain about is whether that time difference is a reflection of the extra weight of the Audi, or if it just needs an extra upshift to get to 60 miles an hour. Either way, in real-world driving it feels capable and willing rather than hot hatch fast. It feels roughly on a par with my BMW E30 320i, which is a slower car on paper, but both feel nice and punchy in the mid-range. Hold on a minute, is that Ed China's Outspan orange car? I believe it is. You don't see one of those every day. So much for power and performance. What about going over bumps and round corners? Yeah, it doesn't invite you to fling it around and play as much as the E30 does. And I guess that's probably the appeal of the E30 over this. It's a bit more sober, it's a bit more sensible. Possibly better over a long run. It's a bit more roomy. The E30 feels really quite little inside.
It's a bit like an executive saloon, but in a more dynamic size.
Yes, it's handy and wieldy and will respond when you want it to. And it's very civilised running along here at 60, not feeling like it's hurrying. The brakes are good. The brakes are discs at the front and drums abaft, but they do a decent job of stopping the car. I guess being drums, they might fade a little bit quicker if you were to take it onto a track, but I'm not sure you would really. It's not that sort of car. It's got that free revving thing that I recognise from the Golf GTI, and it's a really sweet engine.
Yeah, and it can push you back in your seat if you want to.
I'm going to do one more pass.
Yeah.
Steering feel isn't traditionally an Audi strength, but it's pretty neutral in this car. It's unassisted but nicely weighted, and it's easy to place the car into corners, though it doesn't quite have the hardwired directness of the E30. It corners quite flat, and the ride is just slightly on the firm side of comfortable, as you'd probably expect for something badged sport, but without being irritatingly harsh or bouncy. It's good fun. It's more fun than I thought it was going to be.
And that's kind of what I felt as well. I thought, because I bought it thinking, okay, it's not the Quattro, it's not the 5-cylinder, it's a bit of a compromise, but actually, it might just be the best of the bunch.
It's really interesting, yeah. And what a range. I mean, you go from things like a gold 80 CD with velour interior, from a very conservative, quite, depending on how you spec it, it could be a pensioner car, up to, the full-on, well, ultimately the Quattro Sport, redefining the supercar. By way of this is sort of somewhere in between those poles, where you've got some sporty intent, but in really quite a civilised set of clothes, and quite a sensible grown-up driving experience. The interior is quite sombre with lots of black plastic and grey cloth, but the headlining's lighter and there's a sunroof as well, so it's not too much like being trapped down a mine. The dash moulding is shared with the Quattro for extra pub bragging points, but the gauges are conventional dials rather than that car's epic synth pop digital graphics. The seats are firm but supportive, and it's easy enough to make yourself comfortable. They look pretty smart too. One thing you get with the Sport is 3 extra auxiliary gauges down here on the centre console for oil pressure and temperature, as well as battery voltage. It slightly feels as though they were put there mainly to bring some sporting cred, and they were probably more relevant to Michel Mouton in the Acropolis Rally than they were to a regional account executive. But now that the car's heading towards its 40th birthday, then anything that helps diagnose the inevitable occasional unexpected sounds, smells and flickerings is probably well worth having, so bring it on with the gauges. This particular car belongs to my mate Ben Hooper, who you might recognise from previous videos on this channel, and whose name might be familiar from his regular column in Classic Retro Modern magazine, where he's the foreign correspondent from the land of being under 25. If you haven't seen Classic Retro Modern, by the way, then you're missing a treat. It's Ben's main daily driver, although he does also have a rather lovely Volvo 480 ES that I also featured in a video last year. Huge thanks to Ben, by the way, as ever, for taking the time and trouble and letting me have a go of his car. Car Magazine described the Audi AG at the time as a competent car on all fronts. Who am I to try and put it better? It does everything well and nothing badly. Giugiaro's original lines are handsome and well balanced, and for once the facelift in 1984 worked well and didn't make it look like Mouton dressed as lamb. So is it a Golf GTI for grown-ups, or is it your grandpa in Reeboks? Well, neither really. Probably the worst thing you can say about the 80 Sport is that it doesn't quite have that puppy-like eagerness to play that a comparable Mark II Golf GTI or even the BMW E30 does. But one of those in this condition will probably cost you around twice as much as Ben paid for this, and I'm not sure that they're twice as good. On the other hand, it does have enough performance alongside its relaxed, comfortable cruising ability to justify the badges and graphics, although those auxiliary gauges are probably pushing it slightly. Here in 2022, all of that makes it an excellent classic car to run as your main daily driver in the way that Ben does. It looks good, it can more than keep up with modern traffic, it does 30-ish to the gallon in normal mixed use, and you can happily cruise on down to the south of France and back if you want to, like Ben did shortly after we shot this film. The Audi 80 is 50 years old this year, and that's a milestone that had passed me by and I hadn't noticed anybody else celebrating it either. That seems a shame really, because the 80 is the daddy of all those Audi A4s you see right up close in your mirror every time you venture onto a motorway. And although S-Line is now just a trim level with some extra aggression in the body kit and slightly bigger alloys, the Sport here is the one that started it all. So thanks for that, I think.